The glowing tracer rounds cut through the pitch-black sky like deadly fireflies, illuminating the outline of the Allied night fighter for just a fraction of a second. Lieutenant Commander Alistair Nightingale gripped the control yoke of his modified P-61 Black Widow, his knuckles white beneath his flight gloves. Sweat trickled down his temple, despite the frigid air of 20,000 feet above the Normandy countryside on June 7, 1944. The German Junkers Ju-88 night bomber he had been pursuing vanished into a bank of clouds, but Nightingale knew it was still there, hunting for Allied positions to strike. His radio crackled with urgent warnings. 18 Luftwaffe aircraft were prowling these same skies tonight, their pilots experienced night hunters with years of combat experience. Through the scratchy transmission came his orders. Return to base immediately, weather deteriorating, too many bandits. Nightingale's finger hovered over his radio transmitter. Acknowledging would mean turning back, abandoning the vulnerable troops below. The invasion of Normandy was just 36 hours old, the beachheads still tenuous. Every German bomber that got through meant more Allied casualties. His mind flashed to the strange cylindrical devices he had secretly mounted beneath his aircraft's wings, modifications he had installed without authorization, against direct orders from his commanding officer. Devices that no other pilot in the 515th Night Fighter Squadron had installed. Devices that, if they worked as he theorized, could change the nature of night fighting forever. "I'm experiencing radio malfunction," he lied into his transmitter, deliberately garbling his words while toggling the radio to create static. "Will continue mission. Nightingale out." As he banked his aircraft gently to resume his hunt, he patted the unconventional control panel he had wired into the cockpit just hours earlier. No one in the 27th Tactical Air Command knew that one man's defiance that night would rewrite battlefield history and save countless Allied lives on the ground below. Alistair Nightingale was born in the small coastal town of Scituate, Massachusetts, on October 12, 1918, just 1 month before the end of World War I. His father, a shipbuilder with a talent for intricate woodworking, instilled in young Alistair a fascination with how things worked. Their modest home overlooking the Atlantic became a workshop of sorts, where father and son would disassemble and rebuild everything from pocket watches to automobile engines. "Never accept that something can't be improved," his father would say, a philosophy that would later define Alistair's military career. Education didn't come easily to Nightingale. His teachers at Scituate High School found him perpetually distracted, his notebooks filled with technical drawings rather than lecture notes. What they perceived as inattention was actually Alistair's mind working on a different plane. He could visualize mechanical systems in 3 dimensions, seeing possibilities where others saw only established designs. This gift went largely unrecognized in the classroom, but found its purpose in the school's rudimentary science lab, where he excelled at practical experimentation. After graduation in 1936, Nightingale found work as a mechanic at a small municipal airport in nearby Plymouth. There, surrounded by aircraft, his true calling emerged. He spent every free moment observing pilots, absorbing technical manuals, and volunteering to help with maintenance. The airport manager, recognizing his exceptional mechanical intuition, occasionally allowed him to accompany pilots on test flights after repairs. In the air, Alistair found his element, a space where physics, machinery, and human skill converged. When war broke out in Europe, Nightingale knew his path. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in early 1941, months before Pearl Harbor would bring America fully into the conflict. His aptitude tests revealed an unusual combination of mechanical genius and spatial awareness, qualities perfect for the emerging field of night fighting. Selected for pilot training, he surprised instructors with his natural flying ability, as though his years of mentally disassembling engines had somehow prepared him to become one with the aircraft. "He flies like he's part of the machine," noted one flight instructor. "Most men learn to operate an airplane. Nightingale seems to become the airplane." During advanced training, Alistair revealed another unusual talent. He could fly effectively in near-zero visibility conditions when other trainees became disoriented. This ability, combined with his technical acumen, made him an ideal candidate for the specialized world of night fighters. a new and dangerous frontier in aerial warfare. By mid-1943, he had been assigned to the 515th Night Fighter Squadron, one of the first such American units. His fellow pilots, many from privileged backgrounds with college educations, initially viewed the mechanic-turned-pilot with skepticism. Nightingale was neither polished nor traditionally educated. He spoke little, preferred working on his aircraft to socializing, and had a disconcerting habit of modifying standard equipment without permission. Yet in training exercises, he consistently outperformed his squadron mates, especially in the most challenging night conditions. "I don't care if he can recite Shakespeare or name European capitals," his squadron commander told a doubtful operations officer. "When you can't see your hand in front of your face, Nightingale can still find his way home, and more importantly, find the enemy." By the time the squadron was deployed to England in early 1944 to prepare for the invasion of Europe, Nightingale had earned a grudging respect. What his peers didn't know was that each night, while others slept or sought entertainment in nearby villages, Alistair was in the hangar, working on theories about night visibility and aircraft detection that had obsessed him since training. He had no idea that soon, those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for thousands of Allied soldiers fighting to secure the Normandy beachheads. The Allied invasion of Normandy, launched on June 6, 1944, represented the largest amphibious assault in military history. Operation Overlord, as it was codenamed, involved nearly 156,000 troops landing on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the heavily fortified French coastline. The massive operation had been years in planning, with success hinging not just on the ground assault, but on establishing immediate air superiority over the battlefield. The night skies above Normandy presented a unique battle space. Unlike the daylight aerial combat that most people associate with World War II, night fighting was a shadowy, radar-guided duel fought in near-total darkness. The German Luftwaffe had developed sophisticated night bombing techniques during their earlier campaigns, using radio navigation beams to guide their bombers to targets even in complete blackout conditions. These night raids posed a severe threat to the vulnerable Allied troops consolidating their positions after the initial landings. The 515th Night Fighter Squadron was one of several specialized units tasked with countering this threat. Equipped primarily with the P-61 Black Widow, America's first purpose-built night fighter, these pilots operated on the cutting edge of aviation technology. The twin-engine P-61 featured airborne radar, flame-dampening exhaust systems to hide its position, and a distinctive twin-boom design that provided exceptional stability in turbulent conditions. Even with these advantages, night fighting remained enormously challenging, with pilots relying on brief glimpses of enemy aircraft illuminated by moonlight or distant flashes from the ground battle. By the second night of the invasion, June 7th, the situation on the ground remained precarious. While the Americans had secured footholds on Omaha and Utah beaches, and British and Canadian forces had established positions on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, none of the Day 1 objectives had been fully achieved. The German 7th Army was organizing counterattacks, and Allied commanders feared that night bombing could disrupt the crucial flow of men and materials from the beaches to the front. Intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe's Kampfgeschwader 54, a specialized night bombing unit, had been moved to airfields near Caen, just 40 miles from the invasion beaches. This unit operated primarily Junkers Ju-88 aircraft, versatile twin-engine medium bombers that could deliver significant ordnance with reasonable accuracy, even at night. Allied codebreakers had intercepted communications suggesting a major night offensive was planned for June 7th, targeting the logistics hubs being established just inland from the beaches. At Thorney Island Airfield in southern England, the headquarters of the 27th Tactical Air Command, was a flurry of activity as commanders prepared for the expected German air assault. The 515th Squadron was placed on high alert, with pilots briefed on the dire consequences should the German bombers break through. "Gentlemen," the operations officer told the assembled pilots, "what happens tonight may determine whether our boys on those beaches survive until morning. Every German bomber that gets through means American lives lost." The odds were daunting. Weather forecasts predicted broken cloud cover at various altitudes, conditions that favored the defenders in theory, but created dangerous flying conditions. The squadron had 12 operational P-61s available, while intelligence estimated at least 18 German aircraft would participate in the raid. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe pilots were veterans with years of night combat experience, while most of the American night fighter pilots had yet to engage in actual combat. The squadron commander issued strict tactical guidelines: operate in pairs, maintain radio contact, and rely primarily on ground-controlled radar interception to locate targets. Follow procedure exactly, he emphasized. Night fighting is no place for improvisation or heroics. One mistake in the dark could mean a collision or friendly fire incident. He specifically addressed Nightingale, who had a reputation for unauthorized modifications to his aircraft. Lieutenant Commander, I've heard rumors about experiments with your aircraft. Whatever you've been tinkering with ends now. Standard configuration only for this mission. Nightingale nodded obediently, betraying no hint that he had already installed his experimental devices and had no intention of removing them. The standard tactics, he believed, were insufficient for the challenge they faced. The mathematics of aerial night fighting were brutal. Even with radar, the chance of intercepting a specific enemy aircraft in the vast darkness was dismally low. They needed an advantage that the Germans wouldn't expect, and Nightingale was convinced his shadow flares, as he called them, could provide that edge. As the pilots dispersed to prepare for the evening mission, the weight of responsibility settled on their shoulders. They represented the thin line between the vulnerable invasion force and the German bombers intent on reversing the Allied foothold in France. For Alistair Nightingale, the night ahead would either validate years of unconventional thinking or prove that military orthodoxy existed for good reason. The stage was set for a crucial battle in the darkness above Normandy, where one man's defiance of orders might make the difference between success and catastrophe. As dusk descended over the English Channel on June 7, 1944, Nightingale performed his pre-flight checks with methodical precision. The other pilots of the 515th Squadron moved with the nervous energy of men facing their first true combat mission, but Alistair maintained a calm exterior that masked his internal tension. His P-61 Black Widow, aircraft number 739, had been officially cleared for combat, but the aircraft that would take off was not quite the one the maintenance officers had signed off on. Tucked beneath the aircraft's wings, disguised to resemble standard fuel drop tanks, were 6 cylindrical devices of Nightingale's own design. Inside each metal canister was a carefully measured mixture of magnesium, aluminum powder, and a chemical compound he had developed through months of experimentation. These were not weapons in the conventional sense. They would destroy nothing directly, but tools designed to manipulate the night fighter's most precious resource: visibility. "Looking good for tonight, sir?" asked Technical Sergeant Mortimer Finch, Nightingale's dedicated crew chief, who alone knew of the modifications. "We'll find out soon enough," Nightingale replied, patting the fuselage of his aircraft. "Either way, keep this between us." Finch nodded, understanding the risk they were taking. Unauthorized modifications to combat aircraft could result in court-martial, especially if they led to mission failure. At 2100 hours, the 12 P-61s of the squadron thundered down the runway in pairs, disappearing into the darkening sky. Nightingale flew as wingman to Captain Russell Harrington, an experienced pilot, but one who adhered rigidly to protocol. Their assigned patrol sector covered the western approaches to the American sector of the Normandy beachhead, where intelligence suggested the German bombers would most likely approach. 20 minutes into the flight, as they crossed the French coastline, ground control radar reported multiple contacts approaching from the southeast. The German night raid had begun. "All units engage according to briefed parameters," came the controller's voice, tight with tension. "Vectors will follow. Good hunting." Harrington's voice crackled over the radio. "Stay tight, Nightingale. Standard intercept pattern, no heroics." "Copy that," Alistair responded, already calculating. The standard pattern would put them on a predictable course, exactly what the experienced German pilots would anticipate. Below, through breaks in the cloud layer, he could see occasional flashes of artillery and the dim outlines of ships offshore. Thousands of men were down there, vulnerable to the approaching bombers. Ground control vectored them toward an incoming formation, but cloud density made radar contact intermittent. "Tally 2 bandits bearing 170 Angels 18, reported Harrington, using the code for aircraft spotted at 18,000 feet. Moving to intercept, Nightingale followed his flight lead, scanning the darkness. Through a momentary break in the clouds, he caught a glimpse of the distinctive silhouette of a Junkers Ju-88, its twin engines leaving faint exhaust trails against the night sky. Then the clouds enveloped them again, and the contact was lost. "Visual lost," reported Harrington, frustration evident in his voice. "Return to patrol pattern and await further vectors." It was the problem of night fighting distilled, brief contact followed by disappearance into the vast darkness. By the time they repositioned, the German bomber would have moved on toward its target. Standard procedure dictated patience, waiting for another radar vector and opportunity. Nightingale made his decision. "Captain, request permission to split and expand search pattern." It was a reasonable request within doctrine, though not ideal. "Negative, Lieutenant Commander. Maintain formation, those are orders." Alistair took a deep breath. What he did next would either end his career or save lives. "Sir, experiencing navigation light malfunction. Need to descend to check systems." Before Harrington could object, Nightingale banked his P-61 away and descended into a cloud layer, effectively vanishing from his flight lead's vision. Once obscured, he leveled off and switched his radio to a different frequency, one used by ground controllers tracking the overall air picture. He could hear the growing concern in their voices as more German bombers were detected approaching the beachhead. Several had already broken through the defensive screen. Alone now, free from the constraints of formation flying, Nightingale climbed to 22,000 feet, positioning himself above where he calculated the main German bomber stream would be. This violated every tenet of night fighter doctrine, which emphasized horizontal intercepts guided by ground radar. But Nightingale had studied the physics of night visibility extensively and understood something fundamental. The human eye detects movement and contrast more readily from above than from the side, especially against a darker background. He reduced power, allowing his aircraft to glide silently, the flame-dampened engines barely visible. His radar operator, Sergeant Victor Kowalski, looked at him questioningly. "Sir, we're off vector and pattern. Ground control is calling for us." "Radio malfunction," Nightingale replied calmly. "Oxygen check." This was their prearranged signal. Kowalski knew about the experimental devices and his role in deploying them. Kowalski nodded reluctantly. "Oxygen nominal, sir. But if this doesn't work, then we'll both be flying desk jobs by morning," Nightingale finished. "But if it does work, we change everything." Below them, through gaps in the clouds, Nightingale could see faint movement. The German bomber formation, at least 6 aircraft flying in loose trail, invisible to conventional intercepts but detectable from above against the slightly lighter cloud background. He positioned his P-61 ahead of their path and reached for the custom control panel he had installed. "Ready on countermeasures," he ordered. Kowalski placed his hand on a series of switches. "Ready, sir, though I still think you're crazy." "Noted," Nightingale responded with the hint of a smile. "Executing shadow flare sequence now." With that, he pushed the throttles forward and banked into a steep dive directly toward the lead German bomber. At the same moment, Kowalski triggered the first of the experimental devices. From beneath the P-61's wings, a canister released, detonating a second later into what appeared to be a starburst of dim, purplish light. Unlike conventional flares, which burned brightly and illuminated the aircraft that deployed them, Nightingale's shadow flares created a diffuse low-intensity illumination that was barely visible head-on, but caused the clouds below to glow faintly. Against this subtly illuminated background, the dark silhouettes of the German bombers suddenly stood out in sharp relief, their positions betrayed. Before the German pilots could react to this unexpected phenomenon, Nightingale had already lined up his first target and opened fire with his forward-facing 20mm cannons. The Junkers Ju-88 erupted in flames and spiraled downward. The remaining German aircraft scattered in confusion, breaking formation, exactly as Nightingale had anticipated. He triggered a second shadow flare, creating another field of diffuse illumination at a different position. The German pilots, trained to avoid bright lights that might reveal their position, instinctively turned away from even this subtle glow, inadvertently making themselves more visible against it. "Multiple targets, all quadrants," called Kowalski, now fully committed to their unauthorized tactic. "It's working, sir." Over the next 4 minutes, Nightingale executed a series of diving attacks, each preceded by the deployment of a shadow flare positioned to create optimal contrast. The German formation dissolved into chaos. 4 bombers fell to Nightingale's guns in quick succession, their crews never understanding how they had been so clearly spotted in what should have been protective darkness. 2 more shadow flares, 2 more confirmed kills. The remaining German aircraft jettisoned their bombs prematurely over empty countryside and turned back toward their bases, their mission effectively neutralized by a tactic they couldn't comprehend. What should have been a devastating raid on vulnerable Allied positions had been transformed into a German rout by one pilot's unauthorized innovation. Only when his ammunition was expended did Nightingale finally respond to the increasingly urgent calls from ground control. 739 returning to pattern, he reported calmly, experiencing radio malfunction. 6 bandits confirmed destroyed. The controller's voice registered disbelief. "Confirm 6? That's more than the rest of the squadron combined. What's your position?" "Returning to base," Nightingale replied simply. "Low fuel." As he turned his P-61 toward England, Nightingale knew he would face serious consequences for breaking formation and deploying unauthorized equipment. But he also knew that somewhere below, on the fragile Normandy beachhead, Allied troops would live through the night because German bombs had failed to reach them. The mathematics of disobedience had been calculated, and in Nightingale's equation, those lives outweighed his career. What he couldn't have known was that his shadow flare technique had been observed by other pilots in the squadron who had witnessed the sudden appearance of German bombers against the subtle background illumination, or that ground radar operators had tracked the inexplicable dissolution of the German formation when it encountered his lone aircraft. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. By the time Nightingale landed back at Thorney Island, word of his extraordinary success had spread throughout the command center. 6 confirmed kills in a single mission was unprecedented for a night fighter. The other pilots of the 515th Squadron had managed only 5 between them, despite operating in pairs according to doctrine. Even more striking was that all 12 of the squadron's aircraft had returned safely, a rarity in night fighting, where disorientation and accidents often claimed more aircraft than enemy action. Lieutenant Commander Alistair Nightingale taxied his P-61 to its hard stand, the engines sputtering to silence as the propellers slowed. As he climbed down from the cockpit, exhaustion washing over him, he was met not by the military police he half expected, but by his squadron commander, Major Grayson Harlow, and the wing's intelligence officer, Captain Phineas Whitcomb. "Lieutenant Commander," Major Harlow began, his expression unreadable, "you disobeyed direct orders, broke formation in combat, and apparently experienced the most convenient radio malfunction in the history of aviation." Nightingale stood at attention, his face impassive. "Yes, sir." "You also," Harlow continued, single-handedly destroyed 6 enemy aircraft and disrupted the entire German night-bombing offensive. A hint of a smile cracked his stern demeanor. "Perhaps you'd care to explain exactly how you managed that, before I decide whether to recommend you for a Distinguished Flying Cross or a court-martial." For the next 2 hours, in a crowded debriefing room filled with intelligence officers, radar specialists and senior pilots, Nightingale explained his shadow flare concept. He detailed the physics of low-intensity illumination, how it created contrast without revealing the illuminating aircraft, and how it exploited the limitations of human night vision. He described the precise chemical mixture that produced the optimal light spectrum, visible enough to silhouette enemy aircraft, but diffuse enough to prevent pinpointing its source. "It inverts the entire paradigm of night fighting," he concluded. "Instead of trying to see the enemy aircraft directly, you create conditions that force them to reveal themselves against a controlled background." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. It was Captain Whitcomb who spoke first. "We intercepted German communications after your engagement, Lieutenant Commander, They reported being attacked by at least 8 aircraft using some new form of detection technology. They were completely disoriented. That psychological impact is perhaps the most valuable aspect, added a radar specialist. Even if we deploy this on a limited scale, it will force the Germans to reconsider their entire night bombing strategy. Major Harlow remained pragmatic. The question remains, this was an unauthorized modification to combat aircraft. Regulations exist for good reasons, including pilot safety and mission consistency. Nightingale nodded respectfully. I understand. Sir, I accept whatever consequences are deemed appropriate. Before Harlow could respond, the operations room door swung open. A silver-haired officer with the stars of a brigadier general entered, causing everyone to spring to attention. It was Brigadier General Montgomery Sinclair, commanding officer of the 27th Tactical Air Command. At ease, Sinclair ordered, moving to the front of the room. I've just gotten off the telephone with General Eisenhower's headquarters. The German bombing raid that was broken up tonight was headed directly for the main supply dumps supporting Omaha Beach. Had those bombs hit their target, the already tenuous supply situation would have become critical. He fixed his gaze on Nightingale. Preliminary reports suggest your actions prevented a significant setback to our entire Normandy operation. The general studied the diagrams of the shadow flare system that had been hastily sketched on the briefing room's blackboard. Unconventional, unauthorized and brilliant, he finally said. Captain Whitcomb, I want this technique analyzed, refined, and ready for limited deployment within 48 hours. Major Harlow, effective immediately, Lieutenant Commander Nightingale is detached from regular squadron duties and assigned to head a special tactics unit to train other pilots in this technique. He turned back to Nightingale. As for you, Lieutenant Commander, regulations do matter. There will be an official reprimand in your file for unauthorized aircraft modification and failure to follow tactical doctrine. A hint of a smile crossed the general's face. That same file will also contain my personal commendation for exceptional initiative in combat. Sometimes the rulebook needs to be balanced with results. 3 nights later, on June 10, 1944, the Luftwaffe launched another major night bombing raid against the Normandy beachhead. This time, they faced 8 P-61 Black Widows equipped with shadow flares, all piloted by aviators hastily trained by Nightingale. The results were even more dramatic than on the 7th. 18 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of just 1 American night fighter. German air crews reported confusion and disorientation, with some claiming they were being tracked by a new type of radar that could see through clouds. Luftwaffe commanders, puzzled by the sudden ineffectiveness of their night bombing campaign, ordered a temporary halt to operations over Normandy while they assessed the situation. This pause came at a crucial moment in the ground battle, allowing Allied forces to consolidate their positions and push inland without the disruption of night bombing. By the time the Germans resumed night operations a week later, the tactical situation on the ground had shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. For the men of the 515th Night Fighter Squadron, the shadow flare technique transformed their effectiveness. Pilots who had struggled with the limitations of conventional night fighting suddenly found themselves able to engage multiple targets in a single mission. The psychological impact on German air crews was perhaps even more significant. Faced with an enemy that seemed able to see them in darkness, their confidence eroded. Some refused night missions altogether, claiming mechanical problems or illness. On the night of June 17th, 10 days after Nightingale's first use of the shadow flare, the last major German night bombing effort against the Normandy beachhead was attempted. 24 Luftwaffe aircraft participated, and 18 failed to return. Allied intelligence later confirmed that most had fallen victim to the now expanded shadow flare-equipped night fighter force. After that devastating loss, the Luftwaffe High Command withdrew their night bombers to fields further from the front, effectively ceding the night skies over Normandy to Allied control. The immediate consequence of this aerial victory was felt on the ground. Allied supply operations could proceed around the clock without fear of bombing, accelerating the buildup of forces. Medical evacuations, previously limited to daylight hours, could now take place at night, saving countless lives. The entire tempo of the Allied advance increased, pushing German forces back from the coast more rapidly than anticipated. As for Alistair Nightingale, his career took an unexpected turn. Rather than returning to regular squadron duties after training the initial cadre of Shadow Flare pilots, he was reassigned to a special projects unit at the Air Technical Service Command. There, he was tasked with refining and formalizing his innovation for broader deployment. The Shadow Flare system, officially designated the XN-1 Airborne Illumination System, was rushed into limited production for use by night fighter units throughout the European theater. By August 1944, as the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began their race across France, Nightingale found himself promoted to commander and leading a small team of technical specialists. His original concept had evolved into a sophisticated system that combined his illumination technique with improved radar coordination. German night bombing capabilities over Western Europe, once a significant threat, had been effectively neutralized. For his contributions, Nightingale received the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster and the Legion of Merit. The citations carefully avoided specific mention of the Shadow Flare technology, referring only to innovative night-fighting techniques that significantly advanced Allied air superiority. The details of his invention remained classified, part of the shadowy world of wartime technical countermeasures. Yet for all the official recognition, perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement came in the form of letters, dozens of them, forwarded through military channels from infantry units that had been deployed in Normandy during those crucial early days. "Whatever you flyboys did to keep the Krauts off our backs at night made all the difference," wrote one sergeant from the 29th Infantry Division. "We were hanging by a thread those first weeks. Your guardian angels kept us alive." The true measure of Nightingale's impact, however, could be found in the dry statistics of military logistics. Allied supply losses to German night bombing in the first 30 days of the Normandy campaign were 87% lower than planning estimates had projected. This translated directly into more ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements reaching the front lines, and ultimately into lives saved and ground gained. As summer turned to fall and the Allied armies pushed toward Germany, Alistair Nightingale's thoughts often returned to that night over Normandy, when he had chosen to disobey orders and trust his own judgment. The 6 German bombers he had shot down represented only a fraction of his contribution to the war effort. The real achievement was in showing that sometimes the rulebook needed to be questioned, that innovation could come from unexpected places, even from a former mechanic from a small coastal town in Massachusetts. The formal investigation into Nightingale's unauthorized aircraft modifications, initially shelved due to the tactical success, was eventually closed without action in October 1944. The official memorandum noted simply, "While procedural violations occurred, the operational benefits derived from the subject's initiative outweighed any breach of protocol. Recommend case closure with notation regarding proper channels for future technical innovations." By the war's end in May 1945, the Shadow Flare technique had been incorporated into standard night fighter doctrine, taught to pilots in training before they ever reached combat theaters. What had begun as one man's unauthorized experiment had become institutional knowledge passed from veteran to novice as simply the way it's done. Few of the new pilots knew the origin of the technique or the risk its inventor had taken in deploying it without approval. For Alistair Nightingale, the aftermath of war brought a return to civilian life. Declining offers to remain in the newly formed United States Air Force, he returned to Massachusetts in early 1946. Using his military savings and the technical knowledge he had gained, he established a small aviation engineering firm specializing in lighting systems for airport runways and aircraft. The principles that had made the Shadow Flare effective in war found new applications in peace, improving visibility for civilian pilots, making night landings safer, and reducing accidents. In 1952, Nightingale was approached by a team from the Air Force's Wright-Patterson Research Center, seeking his input on night fighting capabilities for the jet age. The Korean War had demonstrated that the fundamentals of aerial combat at night remained challenging, even with advanced technology. Reluctantly returning to military consulting, he helped develop a new generation of aerial illumination systems that incorporated both his original concepts and emerging infrared technology. These systems, the direct descendants of his improvised shadow flares over Normandy, became standard equipment on fighter aircraft throughout the Cold War. Pilots who flew night missions over Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts never knew that their ability to detect enemy aircraft in darkness stemmed from one man's decision to disobey orders on a critical night in 1944. Alistair Nightingale never sought publicity for his wartime innovations. When a military historian contacted him in 1967 for a book on technical developments in air warfare, he declined to be interviewed, suggesting instead that the author speak with the technical teams who had refined his initial concept. "I just had a simple idea at the right moment," he wrote in his brief response. "The people who turned it into a system that saved lives are the ones who deserve recognition." His modesty was characteristic of many World War II veterans, who viewed their contributions as simply part of a larger effort. But those who knew the full story understood that Nightingale represented something special, an example of how individual initiative, even when it meant challenging authority, could change the course of events when the stakes were highest. In June 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a small ceremony was held at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. There, in a new exhibit on night fighting technology, a modified P-61 Black Widow was unveiled, complete with replicas of the original Shadow flare canisters mounted under its wings. The accompanying plaque mentioned Nightingale by name, acknowledging at last his role in developing the technique that had helped secure Allied air superiority over Normandy. Nightingale, by then in his mid-60s and retired, attended reluctantly at the urging of former squadron mates. During the ceremony, he was surprised when General Russell Harrington approached the podium, the same man who had been his flight lead on that fateful night 4 decades earlier. "I wanted to court-martial him that night," Harrington admitted to the assembled guests, many of them veterans of the air war over Europe. "He broke formation, ignored orders, and went off on his own. By the book, he should have been grounded." The former captain, now a retired 4-star general, paused. Instead, he changed the entire equation of night fighting and saved countless lives. Sometimes the greatest service one can render is to recognize when the rule book needs to be set aside. Later that evening, at a reception for the veterans, a reporter asked Nightingale if he had any regrets about his decision to deploy his experimental system without authorization. He considered the question carefully before responding. "The military has procedures for good reasons," he said. "But in war there are moments when the situation outpaces the procedure. In those moments, you have to trust your judgment and accept the consequences, whatever they might be." He smiled slightly. "I was prepared to end my career that night if necessary. What I wasn't prepared to do was watch men die because I failed to use every capability at my disposal." It was a philosophy that encapsulated not just Nightingale's actions, but those of countless other innovators throughout military history. Men and women who found ways to adapt, improvise, and overcome when standard approaches proved insufficient. Their stories often remain untold, overshadowed by the broader narratives of campaigns and battles. Yet these individual acts of initiative, of calculated risk-taking in pursuit of a greater good, represent a crucial element of success in warfare. As the night fighter exhibit at the Air Force Museum attests, Alistair Nightingale's shadow flares eventually received the recognition they deserved. The technique he pioneered saved lives not just in World War II, but in conflicts that followed, as his principles were adapted to new technologies and circumstances. Military doctrine eventually caught up with his insights, incorporating them into standard procedures. Perhaps the most telling testament to Nightingale's impact comes not from official records or medals, but from a letter he received in 1992, shortly before his death. It came from a former infantryman who had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day and fought through the difficult days that followed. "They told us at a reunion about the night fighter who figured out how to keep the German bombers away," the veteran wrote. "I don't know if I'd be alive to write this letter if you hadn't done what you did. My grandchildren wanted me to thank you." Such is the ripple effect of one man's decision, made in darkness high above the battlefields of Normandy. Lieutenant Commander Alistair Nightingale chose to trust his own judgment over established procedure, risking his career to deploy an unproven technology. In doing so, he not only changed the tactical situation in a crucial campaign, but demonstrated a timeless truth about warfare, that sometimes the most valuable weapon is not found in an arsenal but in the human capacity for innovation under pressure. The shadow flares that illuminated enemy aircraft over Normandy stand as a metaphor for how moments of individual courage and creativity can bring light to the darkest situations. In war, as in life, there are times when following the established path is insufficient, when the rulebook must be balanced against the reality on the ground, and when doing the right thing means taking a risk that others might avoid. Nightingale never considered himself a hero. Like many of his generation, he viewed his service as simply doing what needed to be done in extraordinary circumstances. Yet his actions embodied a particular kind of heroism, the courage to think differently when lives hung in the balance, to trust one's judgment even when it meant standing alone, and to accept personal risk for the greater good. In the skies over Normandy on that June night in 1944, one pilot's defiance of conventional wisdom changed the equation of battle. 18 Luftwaffe aircraft ultimately vanished because one man dared to question whether there might be a better way to fight in darkness. The shadow flares he developed became physical manifestations of an idea that transcends any single conflict. That innovation, combined with the courage to implement it, can alter the course of history. As we reflect on these events from the distance of decades, we might ask ourselves, would we have broken the order or obeyed it? Would we have risked career and reputation to try something unproven when lives were at stake? Would we have had the vision to see possibilities where others saw only constraints? These questions have no easy answers, for they speak to the complex balance between discipline and initiative, between following procedure and recognizing when procedure must evolve. What Alistair Nightingale's story teaches us is that in the most critical moments, this balance may tip toward the bold choice, toward the calculated risk that, when successful, redefines what is possible. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not just the physical bravery of facing enemy fire, but the moral courage to challenge convention when lives hang in the balance. For in that courage lies a lesson that extends far beyond the battlefield. That sometimes the most powerful act is not following the path laid out before us, but illuminating a new one.